Mary Catherine O'Brien stood barefoot on the gallows, with a noose around her neck, condemned to die for a crime that would reveal the true character of both accuser and accused. When thundering hoofbeats announced the arrival of a Comanche warrior who claimed this Irish stranger had saved his daughter's life, the town of Broken Creek faced a moment that would test everything they believed about justice, mercy, and the bonds that unite us across all boundaries. But would his testimony be enough to save her from the hanging tree? The rope scratched against Mary's neck like a hungry snake ready to strike. She stood on wooden boards that creaked under her bare feet, looking down at angry faces that wanted to watch her die. The morning sun blazed hot on her back, making sweat drip down her spine despite the cool October air that swept across the Texas plains. Mary Catherine O'Brien, Sheriff Dalton's voice boomed across the dusty town square of Broken Creek. You stand accused of stealing a horse. The punishment is death by hanging. Mary's green eyes searched the crowd below. 3 months ago, these same people had watched her step off the wagon that brought her to this frontier town. She'd carried nothing but a torn letter from her dead brother and hope for a new life. Now they gathered like vultures, waiting to see her swing from the hanging tree. I never stole nothing, Mary said, her Irish accent thick with fear and anger. I found that poor mare half dead by the creek. Any decent person would have helped her. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, stepped forward. Her fancy dress looked out of place among the rough clothes of the other townspeople. That horse belongs to Reverend Murphy's boy. Everyone knows that animal. You took her in the dark of night like a common thief. Because she was dying, Mary's voice cracked. Would you leave God's creature to suffer? The crowd muttered and whispered. Some nodded, remembering how gentle Mary had been with sick animals. Others frowned, remembering she was an outsider, a Catholic girl with no family to speak for her. Mary had worked at the boarding house, scrubbing floors and washing clothes from dawn to dusk. She never complained, never asked for help, never caused trouble. But being quiet and keeping to herself had made people suspicious. They whispered about the Irish girl who talked to herself while she worked, not knowing she was praying in the old language her grandmother had taught her. Sheriff Dalton checked his pocket watch. It's 8 o'clock. Time to carry out the sentence. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of her grandmother back in Ireland, who had taught her to heal with herbs and kindness. She thought of her brother Patrick, who had died of fever before she could reach America. She thought of all the dreams that would die with her on this dusty morning. Please, she whispered, but her voice was lost in the wind that carried the scent of sage and coming winter. The sheriff's hand moved toward the lever that would drop the wooden platform beneath her feet. Mary closed her eyes and began to pray in the old Irish words her grandmother had whispered over her cradle. But just as Sheriff Dalton's fingers touched the lever, a sound rose from the eastern horizon. It started as a whisper, then grew to a rumble, then became a thunder that made the ground shake beneath the gallows. Hoofbeats. Someone was riding hard toward town, and they were coming fast. The crowd turned as one, hands shading their eyes against the bright morning sun. A cloud of dust rose from the prairie like a golden storm, and through it came a single horse and rider, moving faster than the wind itself. Who is that? Someone called out. Can't tell from here, another voice answered. Mary strained to see through the dust and sunlight. Her heart still pounded from her brush with death, but now curiosity mixed with her fear. Who would ride so hard toward a hanging? And why? The rider drew closer, and details began to emerge from the dust cloud. The horse was a painted pony, brown and white patches gleaming with sweat. The rider sat straight and tall, moving with the animal like they were one creature instead of two. Is that an Indian? Mrs. Henderson gasped. Looks like it, Sheriff Dalton said, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. Mary had never seen a Native American before coming to Texas. The people back in Ireland had told wild stories about savage warriors who painted their faces and took scalps. But as the rider approached, she saw something different than the monsters from those tales. The man wore buckskin clothes decorated with beads and feathers. His long black hair was braided with strips of leather and small bones. Most striking of all was the headdress he wore, a magnificent crown of eagle feathers that caught the sunlight like golden fire. The horse slid to a stop just 20 feet from the gallows, sending up a final cloud of dust. The rider looked up at Mary with dark eyes that seemed to see right through her soul. Then he turned to face the crowd of white settlers who had gathered to watch her die. "I am Two Hawks of the Comanche people," he said in clear English that surprised everyone. "I come to speak for this woman." Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, his hand still on his gun. "This is not your concern, Indian. This is white man's justice." "Justice?" Two Hawks repeated, and Mary heard anger in his voice. "You call it justice to kill a woman who saves lives?" "What are you talking about?" Mrs. Henderson demanded. "This girl is a horse thief." Two Hawks swung down from his horse with fluid grace. He stood tall and proud, showing no fear even though he was outnumbered 50-1. "2 weeks ago, my daughter Little Dove was dying of fever. She had wandered far from our camp, chasing a butterfly. She collapsed by the creek that runs past your town." The crowd listened in stunned silence. Mary felt her breath catch in her throat. She remembered that day, remembered the small girl she had found burning with sickness. "This woman," Two Hawks pointed directly at Mary, "found my daughter. She could have left her to die. She could have been afraid. Instead, she stayed through the night. She gave Little Dove water and medicine. She sang to her in the old language until the fever broke." Mary's eyes filled with tears. She had thought no one would ever know about that night. The little girl had been so sick, so alone. Mary had done what her grandmother would have done. She had shown kindness to a suffering child. "That's impossible," Sheriff Dalton said. "How do you know it was her?" Two Hawks reached into a leather pouch at his belt. When he pulled out his hand, Mary gasped. There, gleaming in the morning sun, was her grandmother's wooden cross. The one she had searched for frantically after helping the sick child. The one she thought was lost forever. "Little Dove found this," Two Hawks said, holding up the cross. "She said the kind white woman dropped it when she left. She made me promise to return it if I ever found her again." The crowd began to murmur. Some looked ashamed, others confused. Mary felt hope blooming in her chest like a flower after rain. "You see," Two Hawks continued, "this woman is not a thief. She is a healer. She saved my daughter's life, and now I will save hers." But Sheriff Dalton shook his head. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that she stole a horse. The law is the law." Two Hawks' eyes flashed with anger. "Then your law is wrong, and I will not let you murder an innocent woman." The morning air grew thick with tension. Mary could see the crowd was divided, some beginning to doubt her guilt, others angry that an Indian dared to challenge their justice. She hung suspended between life and death, her fate balanced on the edge of a knife. What would happen next? Would Two Hawks' testimony be enough to save her life, or would it only lead to more bloodshed in the dusty streets of Broken Creek? Sheriff Dalton's hand trembled on his gun as he stared at the Comanche warrior who dared challenge his authority. The entire town square fell silent, except for the wind whistling through the hanging trees' branches, as if even nature held its breath to see what would happen next. "You're outnumbered here, Indian," Dalton said, trying to keep his voice steady. "1 man against 50. Those aren't good odds." Two Hawks smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a wolf who had cornered his prey. "Numbers do not make right from wrong, Sheriff, and I am not alone." Before anyone could ask what he meant, a new sound filled the air. Not hoofbeats this time, but something else. A low, haunting call that seemed to come from the hills around Broken Creek. It sounded like a bird, but Mary had never heard any bird make such a sound. Two Hawks cupped his hands around his mouth and answered with the same call. The sound echoed across the plains, bouncing off the rocky hills that surrounded the town. Within moments, the call was answered again, this time from 3 different directions. "What is that?" Mrs. Henderson whispered, her face pale with fear. "My brothers," Two Hawks said simply. "They wait in the hills. If I do not return by midday, they will come to find me." The crowd began to shift nervously. Women pulled their children closer. Men touched their weapons, suddenly realizing that this wasn't just about one Indian anymore. This was about a whole band of Comanche warriors who might decide to take revenge if their friend was harmed. Mary watched from the gallows, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. She had become the center of something much bigger than a simple hanging. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Old Pete, the liveryman, stepped forward from the crowd. His weathered face was troubled as he looked up at Mary, then at Two Hawks, then at the sheriff. "Sheriff, I got something to say about this whole mess." "Not now, Pete," Dalton snapped. "We've got bigger problems than—" "No, you need to hear this," Pete interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had lived through more than his share of frontier troubles. "I was there the night she brought that horse in. I saw the whole thing." The crowd turned to look at the old man. Mary felt a flutter of hope. Pete had always been kind to her, one of the few people in town who treated her like a human being instead of a suspicious outsider. "That mare was in terrible shape," Pete continued. "Ribs showing, cuts on her legs, foam around her mouth. The girl here didn't steal nothing. She found a dying animal and tried to save it." "But she took the horse without permission," Mrs. Henderson protested. "To the stable," Pete shot back. "She brought it straight to me and asked me to tend it proper. Said she'd pay for the feed and care when she could. Does that sound like a thief to you?" Two Hawks nodded approvingly. "The old man speaks truth. This woman has the heart of a healer, not a thief." Sheriff Dalton looked around at the crowd, seeing doubt creeping into faces that had been certain of Mary's guilt just minutes before. His authority was slipping away like sand through his fingers, and he knew it. "Even if that's true," he said desperately, the law says many things." Two Hawks interrupted. "It says a man cannot be judged without proof. It says witnesses must be heard. It says justice must be fair. Where is the fairness in hanging a woman for showing mercy?" Mary found her voice at last. "Please, Sheriff Dalton, I know I'm just an Irish girl with no family to speak for me, but I've worked hard in this town. I've never caused trouble. I've tried to help wherever I could. Doesn't that count for something?" The sheriff's face was red with embarrassment and anger. He had been so sure of Mary's guilt, so ready to make an example of her. Now, with the whole town watching, he was being made to look like a fool. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "If I let one person break the law, others will think they can do the same. There has to be consequences. Then punish the real crime," Two Hawks said calmly. "Punish cruelty, not kindness. Punish those who would let an innocent creature suffer, not those who would heal it." The crowd was fully divided now. Some still wanted to see Mary hang, convinced that any change to their harsh frontier justice would lead to chaos. Others were beginning to see that they might be about to murder an innocent woman. Mrs. Henderson, who had been Mary's strongest accuser, stood in the middle of the crowd with tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Lord," she whispered, "what have we done?" The banker's wife had lost her own daughter to fever the previous winter. As she looked up at Mary, standing on the gallows, she saw not a thief but a young woman who had risked her own safety to save a child's life. The same kind of courage and compassion she wished someone had shown her little girl. "Cut her down, Sheriff," Mrs. Henderson said suddenly. "Cut her down right now." "What?" Dalton stared at her in shock. "You heard me. This woman is innocent. We've all been fools, letting our fear and suspicion cloud our judgment. Cut her down before we become murderers." The crowd began to murmur more loudly. Some people nodded in agreement, while others shook their heads angrily. The town was splitting right down the middle, and Mary could see that her fate hung in the balance. But just as it seemed like the crowd might reach a decision, another sound filled the air. Not the call of Two Hawks' brothers this time, but something that made everyone's blood run cold. The thunder of many horses approaching fast from the south. And these riders were not friends. Dust clouds rose like smoke signals from 3 different directions as armed men on horseback surrounded the town square. Mary's heart sank as she recognized the blue uniforms and military bearing of the riders. These were not ordinary settlers or even local lawmen. These were cavalry soldiers, and they looked ready for war. "What's the meaning of this?" Sheriff Dalton called out as the lead rider dismounted. Captain Williams was a thin man with cold gray eyes and a mustache that drooped over his stern mouth. His uniform was crisp despite the long ride, and his hand rested casually on his sword hilt as he surveyed the scene before him. "Sheriff Dalton," Williams said, his voice carrying the authority of the United States Army. "We received reports of Indian trouble in this area. I see those reports were accurate." Two Hawks remained perfectly still, but Mary could see the tension in his shoulders. He was calculating his chances, measuring the distance to his horse, counting the soldiers who now surrounded him. "There's no trouble here, Captain," Dalton said quickly. "Just a local matter. We're handling ourselves." Williams laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A local matter? You have a Comanche warrior in your town square, Sheriff. That's a military matter now." The captain's eyes swept over the crowd, taking in the frightened faces of the townspeople, the woman standing on the gallows, and the proud warrior who showed no fear despite being outnumbered 20-1. "You," Williams pointed at Two Hawks, "state your business here." "I came to speak for this woman," Two Hawks replied, his voice steady. "She saved my daughter's life. I could not let her die for an act of kindness." "How touching," Williams said with a sneer. "A savage with a heart. But that doesn't change the fact that you're trespassing on white territory. The treaty states that my people may travel freely to trade." Two Hawks interrupted. "It says nothing about not speaking the truth." William's face flushed with anger. "Don't quote treaties to me, Indian. I know what they say, and I know what they mean. You have no business interfering with white justice." Mary watched the confrontation with growing dread. She had hoped that Two Hawks' testimony might save her life, but now she feared that his presence would only lead to more death. The soldiers looked eager for a fight, their hands resting on their weapons. "Captain Williams," Mrs. Henderson stepped forward bravely. "This man has done nothing wrong. He came here peacefully to give testimony about a crime he witnessed. Surely that's allowed under any law." "Ma'am, you don't understand the situation," Williams replied. "There have been raids in the area. Settlers killed, livestock stolen. We can't take chances with any Indian, no matter how peaceful they claim to be." "But he's just one man," Pete protested. "And he's telling the truth about the girl. I saw her bring that horse in myself." Williams ignored the old man and turned back to Two Hawks. "You have 1 minute to mount your horse and ride out of here. If you're not gone by then, I'll arrest you for trespassing and interfering with local law." Two Hawks' dark eyes met Mary's green ones. In that moment, she saw the impossible choice he faced. If he stayed to defend her, he would likely be killed or captured. If he left, she would probably hang within the hour. "I cannot leave," Two Hawks said quietly. "This woman saved my daughter's life. Honor demands that I save hers." "Honor?" Williams laughed harshly. What would a savage know about honor? The insult hung in the air like a slap. Mary saw Two Hawks' jaw tighten, saw his hand move slightly toward the tomahawk at his belt. The soldiers raised their rifles, sensing trouble. "Please," Mary called out desperately, "don't fight because of me. I'm not worth dying for." Two Hawks looked up at her again, and this time she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was the same look she had seen in her grandmother's eyes when she spoke of the old country, the same look her brother Patrick had worn when he talked about America. It was the look of someone who had found something worth fighting for. "You are wrong," Two Hawks said, his voice carrying across the square. "Every life has worth. Every act of kindness matters. If we do not stand for the innocent, we become no better than the wolves that hunt in the night." Captain Williams had heard enough. "Sergeant Morris, arrest this Indian. Charges of trespassing and disturbing the peace." "Yes, sir," Morris replied, moving toward Two Hawks with iron shackles in his hands. But as the sergeant approached, something unexpected happened. A small voice piped up from the crowd, clear and brave despite its youth. "What?" Everyone turned to see a young boy pushing through the crowd. He was maybe 10 years old, with dirt on his face and determination in his eyes. Mary recognized him as Tommy, the blacksmith's son. "I seen what really happened with that horse," Tommy announced. "I was fishing by the creek that morning, and I seen everything." Sheriff Dalton stared at the boy. "What are you talking about, son?" "The horse," Tommy said, his voice getting stronger. "She didn't steal it. It was already loose, wandering around with cuts on its legs. The Irish lady, she tried to catch it for near an hour. When she finally got a rope on it, she led it straight to Pete's stable. I followed her the whole way." "Why didn't you say something before?" Mrs. Henderson asked. Tommy's face turned red. "Because I was supposed to be doing chores instead of fishing. I was scared Pa would tan my hide if he found out." The crowd began to murmur excitedly. Here was an eyewitness, someone who had seen the whole thing. But Captain Williams was not interested in testimony about stolen horses. "That's all very interesting," he said impatiently. "But it doesn't change the fact that this Indian is trespassing. Sergeant Morris, proceed with the arrest." As Morris reached for Two Hawks with the shackles, the Comanche warrior made his decision. His hand flashed to his tomahawk, and in one smooth motion, he had the weapon in his grip. "I will not be taken prisoner," Two Hawks declared. "I came here in peace, and I will leave in peace. But I will not be treated like a criminal for speaking the truth." The soldiers raised their rifles, and Mary screamed. The morning that had begun with one person about to die now threatened to become a massacre that would leave bodies scattered across the town square. But would Two Hawks fight his way out, or would he find another way to save both himself and Mary from the forces that wanted to destroy them? The crack of a single gunshot split the morning air like thunder, but it wasn't aimed at Two Hawks. Captain Williams had fired his pistol straight up into the sky, and the echo bounced off the hills around Broken Creek like a warning bell that could be heard for miles. "Enough!" Williams roared. "Everyone stay exactly where you are, or the next shot won't be a warning." Two Hawks froze with his tomahawk half raised, his dark eyes calculating the distance between himself and the nearest soldier. Mary could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. 20 rifles were now pointed directly at his chest. "You made a mistake coming here, Indian," Williams said, his voice deadly calm. "But I'm going to give you one last chance to walk away alive. Drop that weapon and mount your horse. Ride out of here and never come back." "And if I refuse?" Two Hawks asked. Williams smiled coldly. "Then you'll join this horse thief on the gallows. We'll have ourselves a double hanging." The crowd gasped. Mary felt the blood drain from her face. This had gone far beyond her simple case of horse theft. Now Two Hawks' life hung in the balance too, all because he had tried to save her. "Captain Williams," Sheriff Dalton said nervously, "I'm not sure we have the authority to—" "I have all the authority I need," Williams cut him off. "Military law supersedes local law when dealing with Indian troubles. This warrior is now my prisoner." But before anyone could move, a new voice spoke up from the crowd. It was Doc Henderson, the town's only real doctor, and Mrs. Henderson's husband. He was a quiet man who rarely spoke in public, but when he did, people listened. "Captain, before you do anything you might regret, there's something you should know about this woman." Williams turned impatiently toward the doctor. "What now?" "3 weeks ago, my wife took ill with a terrible fever," Doc Henderson said, his voice steady but emotional. "I tried everything I knew, but nothing worked. She was dying, Captain. I had given up hope." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears as her husband continued his story. "This Irish girl came to our house in the middle of the night. She'd heard about my wife's condition and wanted to help. She brought herbs I'd never seen before and made a tea that broke the fever within hours. My wife is alive today because of Mary O'Brien's knowledge and kindness." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Many people had known that Mrs. Henderson had been sick, but no one had known how Mary had helped save her life. "That's why I accused her so strongly," Mrs. Henderson sobbed. "I felt guilty for being saved when I knew she needed help herself. I thought if I spoke against her loudly enough, people wouldn't think I was playing favorites. I was wrong. I was terribly, horribly wrong." Captain Williams looked annoyed by this emotional outburst. "That's a very touching story, but it doesn't change the facts. This woman is accused of horse theft, and this Indian is trespassing on white land." "But don't you see?" Doc Henderson pressed on. "She's not just some random criminal. She's a healer. She has knowledge that could save lives all across the frontier. Hanging her would be like burning down a library." Two Hawks nodded approvingly. "The doctor speaks wisdom. This woman has gifts that should be honored, not destroyed." Williams was growing more impatient by the moment. "I don't care if she can raise the dead. The law is the law." "Then what about him?" Tommy, the blacksmith's son, pointed at Two Hawks. "He ain't broken no law either. All he did was tell the truth about what he's seen." "Stay out of this, boy," Williams snapped. But Tommy had found his courage, and he wasn't backing down. "My pa always taught me that telling the truth was the right thing to do. If we punish people for telling the truth, what kind of place are we building here?" The boy's words hit home with many in the crowd. These were frontier people who prided themselves on honesty and straight dealing. The idea of punishing someone for speaking truthfully went against everything they believed in. Old Pete stepped forward again, his weathered hands shaking but his voice strong. "Captain, I've lived on this frontier for 40 years. I've seen good times and bad, peace and war, but I ain't never seen a day when telling the truth was a crime worth dying for. And I ain't never seen a day when saving a life was worth hanging for," added Jim the blacksmith, Tommy's father. More voices joined in from the crowd. People who had been ready to watch Mary hang an hour ago were now speaking up for her. The tide of public opinion was turning, and Captain Williams could see it happening. "This is mob rule," Williams declared angrily. "I won't stand for it. Sergeant Morris, arrest both prisoners immediately." But as Morris stepped forward with his shackles, Two Hawks made a move that surprised everyone. Instead of fighting or running, he slowly lowered his tomahawk to the ground and raised his hands in surrender. "I will not cause bloodshed in this place," he said quietly. "But before you take me prisoner, Captain Williams, there is something you must know. I don't want to hear any more of your lies, Indian." "Not lies," Two Hawks replied. "Truth. The raids you spoke of, the settlers who were killed, the livestock stolen, those were not done by my people." Williams paused, his hand halfway to his gun. "What are you talking about?" "3 days ago, my scouts found the real raiders. White men dressed as Comanche, painting their faces to look like warriors. They have been attacking both your people and mine, trying to start a war." The crowd fell silent. This was news that could change everything. "You're lying," Williams said, but Mary could hear doubt creeping into his voice. "I do not lie about such things," Two Hawks said with dignity. "War benefits no one except those who profit from chaos. My chief sent me here to warn the white settlements, but I was delayed when I heard about this woman's danger." "Even if that's true," Williams said slowly, "why should I believe you?" Two Hawks reached into his saddlebags and pulled out something that made several people in the crowd gasp. It was a military jacket, blue like the ones the soldiers wore, but torn and bloodstained. "This belonged to one of the false raiders," Two Hawks explained. "We found it at their camp. There are markings inside that will tell you which unit he served with. Check for yourself." Williams took the jacket with trembling hands. As he examined the collar, his face went pale. "This is from Fort Richardson. Sergeant Morris, this jacket belongs to Private Jackson. He deserted 2 weeks ago." The implications hit everyone at once. If Two Hawks was telling the truth, then white deserters were behind the recent attacks, not the Comanche. The whole situation was based on lies and false accusations. "Why would you bring this to us?" Williams asked, his voice much quieter now. "Because peace serves everyone," Two Hawks replied. "My daughter is alive because this woman showed kindness to a stranger. Now I show kindness to her people by warning of the real danger." Mary felt tears streaming down her face. Here was a man who had every reason to hate white people, yet he was risking his life to protect them. The courage and honor he showed put her own troubles into perspective. But just as it seemed like the truth might finally set everyone free, a new complication arose. A rider appeared on the horizon, galloping hard toward town. And this rider brought news that would test everyone's resolve in ways they never imagined. The messenger's horse collapsed to its knees the moment it reached the town square, foam dripping from its mouth and sides heaving like a blacksmith's bellows. The rider stumbled off, barely able to stand, his clothes torn and his face streaked with blood and dirt. "Raiders!" he gasped, pointing back toward the eastern hills. "A whole gang of them, maybe 30 strong. They hit the Morrison ranch an hour ago, burned everything, took the horses, killed anyone who fought back." Captain Williams grabbed the messenger by the shoulders. "What did they look like? Describe them exactly." "White men dressed up like Indians," the messenger panted. "But their war paint was all wrong, and they couldn't ride like real Comanche. They're heading this way, Captain. Maybe 2 hours behind me." Two Hawks nodded grimly. "The false raiders I warned you about. They grow bolder." Williams stared at the Comanche warrior, his mind racing. Everything Two Hawks had said was proving true. The real enemy wasn't standing here in the town square. It was approaching fast with murder on its mind. "How many people are in this town?" Williams asked Sheriff Dalton quickly. "Maybe 200, counting the children," Dalton replied. "And how many can fight? 40, 50 at most?" "Most of the younger men are away, driving cattle to market." Williams cursed under his breath. His 20 soldiers plus 50 townspeople against 30 experienced raiders wasn't impossible odds, but it would be a bloody fight. And there were women and children to protect. "We need to prepare defenses immediately," Williams said. "Sergeant Morris, get the men positioned around the "Captain," Two Hawks interrupted, "there is a better way." Williams turned to him suspiciously. "What do you mean?" These false raiders think they fight only frightened settlers. They do not expect to face Comanche warriors fighting alongside the white men. The meaning of his words sank in slowly. Two Hawks was offering to help defend the town against the very raiders who had been blamed on his people. "You would fight with us?" Williams asked in amazement. "Honor demands it," Two Hawks replied simply. "These men have shamed my people by wearing our paint and using our names for evil. They must be stopped." Mary watched from the gallows, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. The morning had brought so many twists and turns that she felt dizzy trying to follow them all. But one thing was becoming clear. Two Hawks was a man of incredible courage and principle. "But how do we know you won't turn on us once the fighting starts?" Sergeant Morris asked suspiciously. Two Hawks looked directly at Mary. "Because my honor is tied to hers now. She saved my daughter, and I have sworn to save her. I cannot break such an oath." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, wiping tears from her eyes. "Captain Williams, if this man is willing to risk his life for our town, the least we can do is show him the same trust. Cut that poor girl down from the gallows and let her help prepare for the attack." "Help how?" Williams asked. "She's a healer," Doc Henderson explained. "If there's going to be a battle, we'll need someone who knows how to treat wounds. My old hands aren't as steady as they used to be." Williams looked around at the faces surrounding him. The townspeople who had been divided an hour ago were now united by the approaching threat. Even those who had wanted to see Mary hang were nodding in agreement. "Sheriff Dalton," Williams said finally, "cut the prisoner down. But she remains under guard until this is over." Dalton climbed the gallows steps and sliced through the rope around Mary's neck with his knife. She collapsed to her knees, rubbing her throat where the coarse hemp had chafed her skin. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Two Hawks. "You saved my life." "And you saved my daughter's," he replied. "Now we must save this town." Williams began barking orders. "Morris, get the men positioned on the rooftops. Henderson, gather all the medical supplies you can find. Dalton, organize the townspeople into groups. Fighters here, women and children in the church." But as the preparations began, Mary noticed something that made her blood run cold. The messenger who had brought news of the attack was standing apart from the crowd, and he kept glancing nervously toward the eastern hills. Something about his behavior didn't seem right. "Two Hawks," she said quietly. "Look at that man, the one who brought the warning." Two Hawks followed her gaze and studied the messenger carefully. After a moment, his eyes narrowed. "His horse is not truly exhausted," Two Hawks observed. "The foam on its mouth is fresh, but its breathing is too regular. And look at his clothes, torn in careful places, not random." Mary felt her heart sink. "You think he's one of them?" "I think he is leading the raiders here," Two Hawks said grimly. "This is a trap." Before they could warn Captain Williams, the messenger suddenly whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that carried across the plains. Almost immediately, answering whistles came from 3 directions around the town. "We're surrounded!" someone screamed. The fake raiders burst from their hiding places in the rocks and brush around Broken Creek, whooping and hollering like wild Indians. But as Two Hawks had said, their war cries were all wrong, and their painted faces looked like a child's attempt at Comanche markings. "Take cover!" William shouted, but it was almost too late. The first shots rang out as the raiders charged toward the town on horseback, firing rifles and pistols as they came. Mary dove behind a water trough as bullets whistled overhead. Two Hawks rolled behind the gallows, his tomahawk back in his hand. But even as the attack began, Mary noticed something that gave her hope. Captain Williams and his soldiers were fighting alongside Two Hawks as if they had trained together for years. The racial hatred that had nearly torn the town apart an hour ago was forgotten in the face of a common enemy. "Mary!" Doc Henderson called from across the square. "We need you at the church. There are wounded coming in." Mary looked at Two Hawks, who nodded encouragingly. "Go," he said. "Save who you can. I will hold this position." As Mary ran toward the church, dodging bullets and burning debris, she realized that the battle for Broken Creek would determine more than just who lived and who died. It would determine what kind of community they wanted to build on the frontier, one based on fear and suspicion, or one based on courage and cooperation. The question was, would they live long enough to make that choice? Blood pooled on the church floor as Mary pressed her grandmother's shawl against a wounded soldier's chest. trying to stop the bleeding that poured between her fingers like water from a broken dam. The sound of gunfire outside mixed with the groans of injured men and the crying of frightened children huddled in the back pews. "Hold still," Mary whispered to the young private, whose name she didn't know. "The bullet went clean through. You'll live if you don't move around." Through the broken church windows, she could see the battle raging in the town square. Two Hawks moved like a ghost between the buildings, his tomahawk flashing in the sunlight as he struck down raiders who had broken through the defensive line. Captain Williams and his men fired from rooftops, while townspeople reloaded rifles behind overturned wagons. "Mary," Doc Henderson called from across the church. "This one's bad. I need your help." Mary quickly tied off the soldier's bandage and rushed to where the doctor knelt beside Sheriff Dalton. The sheriff's face was pale as milk, and a dark stain spread across his shirt where a bullet had found its mark. Can't feel my legs," Dalton gasped. Mary had seen wounds like this before, back in Ireland during the Troubles. The bullet had hit his spine. Even if he lived, he would never walk again. But she couldn't tell him that now. "You're going to be fine, Sheriff," she lied gently, taking his hand. "Just rest and let us work." Outside, the battle was turning ugly. The fake raiders had expected to find frightened settlers who would run at the first sign of trouble. Instead, they faced organized resistance from soldiers and townspeople who fought side by side with grim determination. "They're pulling back," someone shouted from the square. Mary looked up to see the raiders retreating toward the hills, dragging their wounded with them. But she could tell from their movements that this wasn't a real retreat. They were regrouping for another attack. Two Hawks appeared in the church doorway, breathing hard but uninjured. His face and hands were spattered with blood that wasn't his own. "How many wounded?" he asked quickly. 7 so far," Doc Henderson replied without looking up from his patient. 3 serious. 4 that'll mend with time. And the raiders? At least 6 dead. Maybe more. But they'll be back. This was just a test to see how hard we'd fight. Mary wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "How many of them are left?" 20. Maybe 25, Two Hawks said grimly. "Still enough to overrun us if they get organized." Mrs. Henderson came rushing into the church, her fancy dress torn and dirty from helping move supplies. "Mary, dear, there's something you need to know. Old Pete found tracks behind the general store. Someone's been watching the town for days, maybe weeks. The messenger who warned us about the attack," Mary said, understanding immediately. "He was part of their plan all along." Two Hawks nodded. "They studied our defenses, counted our fighters, chose the best time to strike. This is not random violence. This is war." "But why?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice shaking. "What do they want from us?" "Land," Two Hawks said simply. "If enough settlers are killed or driven away, the government will declare this area too dangerous for settlement. Then the raiders can claim it for themselves and sell it to cattle barons or mining companies." The plan was diabolically clever. By disguising themselves as Comanche warriors, the raiders could cause a war between the army and the tribes. In the chaos that followed, honest settlers would flee and leave rich land open for grabbing. "We have to stop them," Mary said firmly. "Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who dreams of building something good out here." A new sound reached their ears from outside. Not gunfire this time, but the low rumble of many horses moving together. Mary peered through a crack in the church wall and saw something that made her heart race with fear. The raiders were coming back, but they weren't alone. Behind them rode at least a dozen more men, heavily armed and looking like they meant business. The reinforcements had arrived. "Dear God," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "There's too many of them now." Two Hawks was already moving toward the door. "I must warn Captain Williams. If they attack with those numbers." A rifle shot cracked from somewhere close by, and Two Hawks stumbled, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers as he leaned against the church wall. "You're hit." Mary rushed to his side. "Just a scratch," he said through gritted teeth, but Mary could see the bullet had done real damage. "Sit down and let me look at that," she ordered, using the same tone she'd used with stubborn patients back in Ireland. As Mary worked to clean and bandage Two Hawks' wound, she could hear Captain Williams shouting orders outside. The soldiers were taking new positions, but everyone knew they were badly outnumbered now. "We can't win a straight fight," Two Hawks said quietly. There are too many of them, and they have better weapons. Then we don't fight fair, Mary replied, an idea forming in her mind. What do you mean? Mary looked around the church at the wounded soldiers, the frightened townspeople, and the children huddled in the corners. All of these people were depending on her now, just like the little Comanche girl had depended on her by the creek. You said these raiders don't know how to be real Comanche warriors, Mary said slowly. What if we use that against them? Two Hawks' eyes lit up with understanding. You want to trick them. I want to beat them at their own game, Mary corrected. They're pretending to be something they're not. Maybe it's time we did the same. But before she could explain her plan, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the air again. The final attack was beginning, and this time the raiders meant to finish what they'd started. Through the broken windows, Mary could see the fake Comanche warriors forming up for their charge. Their painted faces looked fierce in the afternoon sun, and their weapons gleamed with deadly promise. The question was, would her desperate plan work? Or would the town of Broken Creek become just another graveyard on the Texas frontier? The war cry that split the afternoon air wasn't what the fake raiders expected to hear. Instead of frightened screams from the townspeople, a bone-chilling Comanche battle call echoed from the hills north of town, and it was answered by similar calls from the east and west. What the hell? Cursed Jake Morrison, the leader of the raiders, as he pulled his horse to a stop just outside rifle range. From behind rocks and trees around Broken Creek, real Comanche warriors began to appear. Their war paint was authentic, their weapons were traditional, and their horses moved with the fluid grace that no white man could imitate. Two Hawks had used the lull in fighting to signal his brothers who waited in the hills. When they heard his call for help, they had come without question, ready to fight alongside the white settlers against the men who had dishonored their people. Boss, one of the raiders said nervously, those ain't fake Indians like us. Those are the real thing. Morrison's face went pale beneath his smeared paint. His gang had been confident when facing outnumbered soldiers and settlers, but fighting actual Comanche warriors was a different matter entirely. Mary watched from the church window as the real warriors took positions around the town. Their leader, an older man with silver hair and scars across his chest, rode forward to speak with Two Hawks. That's Windwalker, Two Hawks explained to Mary as she finished bandaging his shoulder. My father. He leads our war band. Your father? Mary's eyes widened. You're a chief's son? I will be chief someday, if I live long enough to earn the honor, Two Hawks replied. But today, I fight not as a future chief, but as a man who owes a debt to a brave woman. Outside, Captain Williams was staring in amazement at the Comanche warriors who had appeared to help defend the town. Just hours ago, he had been ready to arrest Two Hawks as an enemy. Now that same warriors' people were risking their lives to save white settlers. Can we trust them? Sergeant Morris asked nervously. They came when called, Williams replied. That's more than I can say for some white men I've known. Windwalker rode up to the church and dismounted with the dignity of a man accustomed to command. When he entered the building, Mary felt the power of his presence like a physical force. You are the woman who saved my granddaughter, he said in careful English. Mary nodded, suddenly feeling very small under the great chief's gaze. Little Dove has told all our people about your kindness, Windwalker continued. She says you have the spirit of a true healer. Today, we fight to protect that spirit. The old chief's words hit Mary like a thunderbolt. She had thought of herself as just an Irish girl trying to survive on the frontier. But in the eyes of these proud warriors, she was something more. Someone worth fighting for. Worth dying for. I don't deserve such honor, Mary said quietly. Honor is not something you deserve, Windwalker replied with a slight smile. Honor is something you earn. And you, daughter of the Green Island, have earned more than you know. The sound of gunfire erupted outside as the raiders realized they were now facing a much larger force than they had planned for. Morrison was shouting orders, trying to rally his men, but Mary could hear panic in his voice. They're breaking up, Captain Williams called from the square. Some of them are trying to run. Through the window, Mary could see the fake raiders scattering in all directions. But the real Comanche warriors were faster, cutting off escape routes and driving the criminals back toward the center of town. This is our chance, Two Hawks said, struggling to his feet despite his wounded shoulder. If we can capture Morrison alive, he can tell us who hired his gang. This conspiracy goes deeper than just land grabbing. Mary helped him stand, marveling at his determination. "You should rest. You've lost a lot of blood." "I will rest when justice is done," Two Hawks replied firmly. But as they prepared to join the final battle, an unexpected complication arose. Through the back door of the church burst a man Mary had never seen before. Tall, well-dressed, and carrying a gun that he pointed directly at her heart. "Nobody move," the stranger commanded. "I'm taking the girl with me." Captain Williams spun around, his own weapon ready. "Who are you? What do you want with her?" The man smiled coldly. "Name's Colonel Patterson, and this little Irish witch has caused me more trouble than she's worth. But she's going to help me get out of here alive, or she's going to die trying." Mary's blood turned to ice as she realized the truth. Patterson was the man behind everything. The fake raids, the attempt to start a war between settlers and Indians, the whole conspiracy to grab land and profit from chaos. "You're the one who hired Morrison and his gang," Mary said. "Smart girl," Patterson sneered. "Too bad smart girls don't live long on the frontier." Two Hawks took a step forward, but Patterson swung his gun toward him. "Don't even think about it, Indian. I've got nothing to lose now. My plan's ruined, my men are scattered, and the army knows who I am. But I can still take some of you with me." Mary looked around the church at the wounded soldiers, the frightened children, and the people who had become her friends. She thought of little Dove, the sick child she had helped by the creek. She thought of her grandmother in Ireland, who had taught her that sometimes the greatest courage was in the smallest acts of kindness. "Let them go," Mary said quietly. "Take me if you want, but let the others live." "Mary, no!" Mrs. Henderson cried out. But Mary had made her choice. She stepped forward, placing herself between Patterson's gun and the people she had come to love. "You want a hostage?" she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Then take me. But these people have done nothing to you." Patterson grinned with cruel satisfaction. "Now that's more like it. Move toward the door, nice and slow." As Mary walked toward what might be her death, she caught Two Hawks' eye one last time. In his gaze, she saw not defeat, but a promise. Whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. But would even the combined courage of soldiers, settlers, and Comanche warriors be enough to save her from a desperate man with nothing left to lose? Colonel Patterson's gun barrel pressed cold against Mary's temple as he backed toward the church door, using her body as a shield against the weapons pointed in his direction. Every step felt like walking through thick mud, and Mary could smell the sweat of fear mixing with gunpowder smoke in the cramped church. "Easy now," Patterson called out to the soldiers and warriors who surrounded them. "One wrong move, and the Irish girl's brains decorate these holy walls." Captain Williams kept his rifle trained on Patterson, but Mary could see the frustration in his eyes. The colonel was using her expertly, keeping her between himself and any possible shot. "Let her go, Patterson," Williams demanded. "Your fight is with the army, not with innocent civilians." Patterson laughed bitterly. "Innocent? This little witch ruined months of planning. If she'd just minded her own business instead of playing hero to sick Indian children, none of this would have happened." Mary felt anger flare in her chest despite her fear. "So it's my fault that you're a murderer and a thief?" "Shut up," Patterson snarled, pressing the gun harder against her head. "You don't understand what's at stake here. This land is worth millions, and I won't let a bleeding heart Irish girl stand in the way of progress." Through the broken windows, Mary could see that the battle outside was winding down. Most of Patterson's fake raiders were either dead, wounded, or captured. Jake Morrison sat tied to a fence post, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, while real Comanche warriors guarded him. "Your men are finished," Two Hawks said, his wounded shoulder making him lean against the church wall. "Surrender now, and Captain Williams might let you live to stand trial." "Stand trial?" Patterson's voice cracked with desperate laughter. "You think I'm stupid enough to trust military justice? I know what happens to officers who betray their oath. They put you in front of a firing squad." Mary could feel Patterson's hand shaking as he held the gun. The man was coming apart, and that made him even more dangerous. A calm enemy might show mercy, but a panicked one would kill without thinking. "Please," Mrs. Henderson spoke up from where she knelt beside. Wounded Sheriff Dalton. "She's just a young woman trying to help people. What threat could she possibly be to a powerful man like you?" "You want to know what threat?" Patterson's voice rose to a near shout. "I'll tell you exactly what threat she is." He paused, breathing heavily, and Mary could sense that whatever he said next would reveal the full scope of his evil plan. "This land we're standing on sits right on top of the biggest silver deposit in Texas," Patterson continued. "My partners and I have been working for 2 years to clear out the settlers and Indians so we can claim it legally. A few fake raids, a little war between the tribes and the army, and this whole area gets declared too dangerous for settlement." The pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place for Mary. That's why you needed the raids to look like Indian attacks. If people thought the Comanche were the enemy, the army would drive them away and the settlers would flee. Exactly. And it was working perfectly until you had to go and save that Indian brat by the creek. When 2 Hawks came here to testify for you, it proved that not all Indians were hostile. People started asking questions, looking closer at the evidence. Captain Williams's face darkened with understanding. "The reports you sent to headquarters about increased Indian activity, you were setting up the whole territory for a military campaign. A campaign that would have made me a hero," Patterson said bitterly. "Colonel Patterson, the man who tamed the wild frontier, but instead I'm a fugitive with a bounty on my head." Mary felt a strange calm settling over her as she understood the full evil of what Patterson had planned. Innocent people, both white and Indian, would have died in a war built on lies, all so he could get rich from stolen land. "You won't get away with this," she said quietly. "Too many people know the truth now." "Maybe not," Patterson admitted, "but I can still make sure you don't live to see justice done." His finger tightened on the trigger, and Mary closed her eyes, thinking of her grandmother's prayers and hoping they would carry her safely to whatever came next. But the gunshot, when it came, wasn't from Patterson's weapon. A rifle cracked from somewhere outside the church, and Patterson jerked forward with a cry of pain. His gun spun away across the floor as he clutched his right shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "Drop him!" Captain Williams shouted, and 6 soldiers rushed forward to pin the wounded colonel to the ground. Mary spun around to see who had fired the shot that saved her life. Through the church doorway stepped a small figure that made her heart leap with joy and amazement. It was Little Dove, 2 Hawks' daughter, holding a rifle almost as big as she was. The little girl who Mary had nursed back to health now stood proud and determined, smoke still curling from the barrel of her weapon. "Nobody hurts my white mother," Little Dove said in careful English, her dark eyes flashing with the same courage Mary had seen in her father. 2 Hawks limped over to his daughter, his face mixing pride with concern. "Little Dove, where did you learn to shoot like that?" "Grandfather Windwalker taught me," the girl replied. "He said a warrior must be ready to protect those who protect others." Mary knelt down and embraced the brave little girl who had risked everything to save her. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." "You saved mine first," Little Dove replied simply. "Now we are even, like father and grandfather taught me." Captain Williams stood over the captured Patterson, his face grim with disgust. "Colonel Patterson, you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, murder, and about a dozen other charges. You'll face a military tribunal for your crimes." Patterson looked up from where he lay, bleeding on the church floor. "You think you've won? This land will still be taken. If not by me, then by someone else. Progress can't be stopped." "Maybe not," Mary said, looking around at the mixed group of soldiers, settlers, and Comanche warriors who had fought together. "But it doesn't have to come through murder and lies. People of different backgrounds can work together if they choose to." Windwalker entered the church, his weathered face showing approval as he looked at his granddaughter. "Little Dove has honored our family today, but the real honor belongs to the woman who taught her that courage comes from protecting others, not from destroying them." As Mary looked around the church, at the wounded being tended, the children comforted, and enemies captured, she realized that something important had changed in Broken Creek. The barriers of race and suspicion that had divided the community were beginning to crumble. But would these new bonds be strong enough to survive the challenges that lay ahead? And what would happen when word of the day's events spread across the frontier, bringing both opportunity and new dangers to their small town? 3 weeks later, Mary stood in the doorway of what had once been the town's only saloon, now transformed into Broken Creek's first real medical clinic. Sunlight streamed through clean windows as she watched Doc Henderson teach Little Dove how to mix willow bark tea for pain relief. The measurements must be exact. the old doctor explained patiently. Too little, and it won't help. Too much, and it can make someone sick. Little Dove nodded seriously, her small hands carefully measuring dried bark into a ceramic bowl. Since the battle, she had become Mary's shadow, eager to learn everything about healing that her white mother could teach her. "How is Sheriff Dalton today?" Mary asked Mrs. Henderson, who was rolling bandages at a table near the window. "Better than we hoped," Mrs. Henderson replied with a smile. "He's learning to get around in that wheeled chair Two Hawks built for him. Says he can still do his job as long as he doesn't have to chase bank robbers on foot." The changes in Broken Creek went far beyond new furniture and medical supplies. Captain Williams had kept his word about protection, stationing a permanent garrison of soldiers at the edge of town. But more importantly, Wind Walker's band had established a winter camp in the nearby hills, creating the first peaceful coexistence between settlers and Comanche in the region. "Mary," Doc Henderson called softly, "we have a visitor." She turned to see Two Hawks entering the clinic, his wounded shoulder now healed but still stiff on cold mornings. In his hands he carried a beautiful blanket woven with intricate patterns in blue and gold. "This is from the women of my tribe," he said, offering the gift to Mary. "They wanted to honor the woman who saved Little Dove and brought peace between our peoples." Mary accepted the blanket with trembling hands. The wool was softer than anything she had ever touched, and the designs told stories of friendship and courage. "It's beautiful, but I don't deserve such a gift." "You deserve much more," Two Hawks replied. "My father has been meeting with your Captain Williams and the territorial governor. They are drawing up new treaties that will allow our peoples to trade and live in peace." "Really?" Mary's eyes lit up with hope. "The silver Colonel Patterson wanted so badly will still be mine," Two Hawks continued. "But the profits will be shared between the town and my tribe. Both our peoples will benefit, instead of one destroying the other." Little Dove looked up from her work with the willow bark. "And I will learn to be a healer like my white mother, so I can help both our peoples when they are sick." Mary felt tears welling up in her eyes. When she had first arrived in Broken Creek, she had been a lonely Irish girl with nothing but the clothes on her back. Now she was part of something larger, a community that crossed all the old boundaries of race and suspicion. "There's something else," Two Hawks said, his voice becoming more formal. "Wind Walker has asked me to invite you to our harvest celebration next week. It is a great honor. No white person has ever been welcome at such a gathering." "I would be honored to attend," Mary replied. Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly. "And we'll have our own celebration here in town the same night. A feast to honor all the heroes who saved Broken Creek." "Heroes?" Mary laughed. "I'm no hero. I just did what anyone would do." "That's where you're wrong," Doc Henderson said gently. "Not everyone would risk their life for a sick child they'd never met. Not everyone would stand up to injustice even when it meant facing the hangman's noose. You showed us all what real courage looks like." Through the clinic windows, Mary could see the daily life of the transformed town. Former enemies now traded goods and shared knowledge. Children played together, regardless of the color of their skin. The hanging tree that had once been a symbol of harsh frontier justice now served as a meeting place where disputes were settled with words instead of violence. "Mary," Little Dove said suddenly, looking up from her medicine mixing, "will you teach me your grandmother's songs? The ones you sang when I was sick?" "Of course," Mary replied, kneeling down beside the little girl. "But first, let me tell you the story behind them. They come from a land called Ireland, far across the ocean, where my people learned that sometimes the most powerful medicine is simply showing someone that they are not alone." As Mary began to tell the story of her homeland, she realized that she had found something she had been searching for without knowing it. Not just a place to live, but a true home. A place where her skills were valued, her kindness was returned, and her courage had made a real difference in the world. Two Hawks listened to her soft Irish accent, mixing with Little Dove's eager questions, and he smiled. The woman who had saved his daughter had also saved an entire community from tearing itself apart with fear and hatred. But outside the clinic, new challenges were already appearing on the horizon. A stagecoach was approaching Broken Creek, carrying passengers who would bring fresh opportunities and new dangers to the growing frontier town. The question was, would the lessons learned in blood and courage be strong enough to face whatever came next? And would Mary's quiet strength continue to be the heart that held this unlikely community together. The letter that arrived with the morning stagecoach shook in Mary's hands like a leaf caught in a winter storm, and the words written on expensive paper seemed to dance before her eyes as she read them for the third time in disbelief. "What does it say?" Mrs. Henderson asked anxiously, setting down her cup of coffee in the clinic's front room. "It's from the territorial governor," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wants to offer me an official position as territorial health supervisor. I would travel to settlements across Texas, teaching people about medicine and healing." Little Dove looked up from where she was grinding herbs at the work table. "You would leave us?" The pain in the child's voice cut through Mary's heart like a sharp knife. Over the past month, Little Dove had become more than a student. She was like the daughter Mary had never expected to have. I don't know," Mary admitted honestly. "It's a great honor, but this is your home now," Two Hawk said firmly as he entered the clinic carrying fresh water from the well. "These people need you. My daughter needs you." Mary walked to the window and looked out at the town that had almost killed her, but had instead become the place where she truly learned to live. Children played in the dusty street, while their mothers, both white and Comanche, shared recipes and stories. Men who had once eyed each other with suspicion now worked together building new houses and shops. "The governor says I could help hundreds of people," Mary said thoughtfully. "Think of all the settlements where people are dying from diseases that could be prevented with proper knowledge." Doc Henderson, who had been quietly reading his own mail, suddenly looked up with surprise. "Mary, there's something you should know. I received a letter too." "What kind of letter?" "From the medical college in Austin. They want to offer you a scholarship to study real medicine, to become a licensed doctor. You would be one of the first women in Texas to receive such training." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this unexpected news. Mary had always thought of herself as just someone who knew a few old remedies her grandmother had taught her. The idea of becoming a real doctor seemed impossible. "A doctor?" Little Dove's eyes went wide. "You would be like Grandfather Windwalker, but for healing instead of war?" "Something like that," Mary said with a weak smile. Mrs. Henderson stood up and began pacing around the small room. "This is wonderful news, dear. Think of all the people you could help with proper medical training." "But what about here?" Two Hawks asked, his voice showing the strain of trying to hide his emotions. "What happens to the friendship between our peoples if you leave? You are the bridge that connects us." Mary felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. For so long, she had dreamed of having options, of being valued for her skills. Now that those dreams were coming true, she realized how complicated getting what you wanted could be. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "there's a way to do both." Before anyone could ask what she meant, Sheriff Dalton wheeled his chair through the clinic door, his face grim with concern. "Mary, we've got trouble," he announced without ceremony. "Real trouble this time." "What kind of trouble?" Doc Henderson asked. "Remember Colonel Patterson? The man's been talking to anyone who'll listen from his jail cell. Turns out he wasn't working alone. There's a whole group of men back east who invested money in his land-grabbing scheme." Mary felt her stomach drop. "What does that mean for us?" "It means they're not happy about losing their investment," Dalton continued. "Word is they're sending someone to investigate what happened here. Someone with enough political power to cause real problems." Two Hawks moved closer to the window, his warrior instincts alert to danger. "When will this person arrive?" "Tomorrow, maybe the day after. And Mary, there's something else you need to know." The sheriff paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. "This investigator has been asking specific questions about you, about the Irish girl who caused all the trouble. Someone's been feeding him information, painting you as the villain in this whole mess." "Mrs. Henderson gasped. "That's ridiculous. Mary saved this town." "I know that, and you know that," Dalton replied. "But powerful men with lots of money can make even heroes look like criminals if they try hard enough." Mary sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from dreams of the future to fears for her safety. "So the choice might be made for me. I might have to leave whether I want to or not." "Not if we have anything to say about it," Little Dove declared, her young voice filled with determination that reminded Mary of her father. "Little Dove is right," Two Hawks said firmly. "You stood with us when we needed help. Now we stand with you." Doc Henderson nodded in agreement, This community owes you a debt that can never be repaid. We won't let some corrupt politicians destroy you for doing what's right." As the group discussed ways to protect Mary from the coming investigation, she found herself thinking about the lessons her grandmother had taught her back in Ireland. Sometimes, her grandmother had said, the hardest battles were not fought with weapons, but with truth and courage, and the willingness to stand up for what's right even when the odds seemed impossible. "There's something I need to tell all of you," Mary said, her voice growing stronger as she made her decision. "I've been thinking about these job offers, and I realize they're both wonderful opportunities, but they're also running away." "Running away from what?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "From the real work that needs to be done here," Mary replied. "Building something new, something that proves people of different backgrounds can live and work together. If I leave now, I'm abandoning that work when it's still fragile." Two Hawks smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "You mean you're staying?" "I'm staying," Mary said firmly. "And when this investigator arrives, he's going to find a community that won't be intimidated by threats or corruption. He's going to learn that some things are more important than money and power." But even as Mary spoke these brave words, she wondered if their small frontier town really had the strength to stand against the kind of wealth and influence that was coming their way. The battle for Broken Creek was far from over. In some ways, it was just beginning. What weapons could a former horse thief, a wounded Comanche warrior, and a handful of determined settlers use against enemies who fought with lawyers and politicians instead of guns and tomahawks? The investigator who stepped off the stagecoach looked nothing like the rough frontier men who usually visited Broken Creek. Hamilton Ashford wore a perfectly pressed suit, despite the dusty journey, carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most settlers made in a year, and had the soft hands of a man who had never done physical labor in his life. "Sheriff Dalton, I presume," Ashford said, extending his hand without warmth. "I am here, on behalf of the Territorial Investment Commission, to investigate the recent disturbances in this area." Dalton shook the offered hand, but kept his expression neutral. "Welcome to Broken Creek, Mr. Ashford, though I should warn you, things aren't quite what they seem in the reports you've probably read." "Indeed?" Ashford's eyebrows rose with skeptical amusement. "And what exactly should I expect to find different from the official accounts?" Before Dalton could answer, Mary appeared from the clinic, carrying her medical bag and wearing the simple dress that had become her uniform as the town's healer. She had decided to meet this challenge head-on, rather than hide from it. "Mr. Ashford," she said, stepping forward with her chin held high. "I'm Mary O'Brien. I believe you've come here to ask questions about me." Ashford studied her with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to finding weakness in his opponents. "Ah, the infamous Irish girl who single-handedly destroyed a legitimate business venture and caused the death of several honest investors. Is that what they told you?" Mary asked calmly. "That Colonel Patterson and his gang of murderers were honest businessmen?" "I have here," Ashford said, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick folder, "sworn statements from multiple witnesses that you deliberately interfered with legal land acquisition procedures, that you conspired with hostile Indians to attack innocent settlers." Mary felt her temper flare, but she forced herself to stay calm. "And do your sworn statements mention that Patterson's men were disguised as Comanche warriors? That they were trying to start a war between the tribes and the army so they could steal land?" "Hearsay and speculation," Ashford dismissed. "The fact remains that valuable property has been lost, investors have been ruined, and it all traces back to your meddling in affairs that were none of your concern." A crowd was beginning to gather in the street, as word spread that the investigator had arrived. Mary could see familiar faces. Mrs. Prue Henderson, Doc Henderson, Old Pete, Tommy, the blacksmith's son, all the people who had witnessed the truth of what happened. "Mr. Ashford," Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, "perhaps you should hear the whole story before you make any judgments." "And who might you be, madam?" "I'm the banker's wife, and I was one of Mary's strongest accusers when she first arrived. I'm also the person whose life she saved when I was dying of fever." Ashford looked annoyed at the interruption. "I'm sure your gratitude is touching, but personal feelings cannot override legal realities." "Legal realities?" Two Hawks' voice carried across the square as he approached with Little Dove at his side. "What is legal about men disguising themselves as my people to commit murder?" Ashford's face went pale, as he took in Two Hawk's appearance. The traditional Comanche clothes, the braided hair, the proud bearing of a warrior. You're an Indian. I am Two Hawks of the Comanche people, he replied with dignity. And this woman saved my daughter's life. Sir, I must warn you that consorting with hostile Indians is a serious federal offense. Hostile? Windwalker's voice boomed as the old chief appeared at the edge of the crowd, flanked by several of his warriors. We have a treaty with your government. We have lived in peace with these settlers for months. Ashford looked around nervously as he realized he was surrounded by the very people his reports had described as enemies. But instead of the savage warriors he expected, he saw families, men, women, and children of different races working and living together. This is impossible, he muttered, shuffling through his papers. The reports clearly state that this area is in constant conflict. The reports are lies, Captain Williams said as he joined the growing crowd. I've filed my own report with territorial headquarters, detailing Colonel Patterson's conspiracy and the heroic actions of Miss O'Brien and her allies. Mary watched Ashford's confident facade beginning to crumble as he faced the unified testimony of an entire community. But she knew that men like him didn't give up easily. Even if there were irregularities in the original plan, Ashford said desperately, the fact remains that legitimate investors have lost money. Someone must be held responsible. You're right, Mary said quietly. Someone should be held responsible. She reached into her medical bag and pulled out a document she had been carrying for weeks, one of the letters offering her a position with the territorial government. Mr. Ashford, what would you say if I told you that the territorial governor himself has offered me an official position, that the medical college in Austin wants to give me a scholarship? Ashford stared at the official papers, his face going from pale to red. That's impossible. These people are criminals. No, Doc Henderson said firmly. These people are heroes. And if your investors hired Colonel Patterson to commit murder and theft, then they're the real criminals here. Little Dove stepped forward and looked up at Ashford with the fearless gaze of a child who had learned that truth was more powerful than intimidation. My white mother saved my life, she said in careful English. She saved this whole town. If you try to hurt her, you are no better than the bad men who painted their faces like my people. Ashford looked down at the small girl, then around at the faces of the crowd. White and Indian, young and old, all united in their determination to protect the woman who had brought them together. I need to reconsider my report, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she knew this victory was just the beginning. Word would spread across the frontier about the town where former enemies had become friends, where an Irish immigrant had become a bridge between cultures, where justice had triumphed over greed. Mr. Ashford, she said gently, you're welcome to stay in Broken Creek as long as you like. See for yourself what people can build when they choose cooperation over conflict. As the crowd began to disperse, Mary looked around at the faces of the people who had become her family. She thought about the choices that had brought her to this moment. The decision to help a sick child, the courage to stand up for what was right, the faith to believe that people could change. Her grandmother had been right about America. It truly was a land where anyone could build a new life. But Mary had learned something her grandmother couldn't have known. The best new lives were built not alone, but together with others who shared the same dreams of hope, healing, and home. The hanging tree still stood at the edge of town, but now children played beneath its branches while their parents planned a future where justice grew from compassion rather than fear. And in the heart of it all stood a young Irish woman who had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with leaving home, but with finally finding it.